Hi, this is Anthony Hansis with Forged by Geeks. I'm here today to talk to you a little bit about our maps and how we went from our really early prototypes to what you see today up on the Kickstarter. So, what we've got right here, right now, that you see is one of our very first maps that we took to playtest. Naturally, we had a bunch of other maps that we playtested earlier just with me and my partner. Those included maps that were just simple colored blocks and single printed sheets for an entire map, where we moved around little pegs and everything like that just to test the core mechanics and how they worked. This was actually one of the very first printings of a map that we took to various playtest groups and ran through almost a dozen playtests alone, just to see how our core mechanics were flowing and test out everything from enemy movement to some of our turning rules to the just core map mechanics. So, what makes this map different from what ended up going into the final game? Well, first off, you'll see that instead of a bridge, we had a base. And that base was sitting on one of the thin sides as opposed to one of the longer ends. A couple things actually were relatively the same. So here you'll see we have our main road that, just like in the main game, once enemies enter into the road, they will more or less just run right at the base, or in the current version, the bridge. We also have the side paths and the various turning intersections and other elements. One of the things we learned very quickly from this map was that having the two road differentiation was great. Having multiple options and multiple lanes incoming was the right idea, and we were on the right track there, but it needed a lot of work. One of the other big things we learned from this map was we had this huge set of rules and mechanics and everything else to cover all of our different tile sets that you see out here. And it just ended up being a little overwhelming, and a lot of them really didn't add any substantial value to the game. So we kept a few, like we kept the grass that you see here, we kept the water, we kept the two roads, and we also kept the concept of buildings. And finally, rubble. What we didn't end up keeping was a lot of other options, and I'll get into what some of those were and why they didn't end up proving valuable for the game. So for example, you see sand right here. Sand was kind of just a variant on rubble. So with rubble, then, as it is now, when you move into rubble, it takes twice as many movement points to move into it. With sand, we had the exact opposite. It took twice as many movement points to move out of sand as opposed to going in. This really didn't add much value to the game and just confused players. They're like, which one, and we just ended up cutting it as a result. We also had three concepts of almost like building style structures. So we had rocks, as you see here, we had single story structures, and we had two-story structures. This was built around one of our early mechanics that involved our mechs having an optional jump jet equipment pack. The idea was that a mech could leap onto either the building or the two-story building in order to gain some either combat advantage or range advantages or other bonuses that would be associated with having a higher vantage point. Not to mention removing almost all line of sight obstructions. While this sounded really cool and a lot of people thought it was a great idea, it was really hard to balance, especially in the concept of trying to prevent line of sight with some of our more complicated map layouts, while also making it just really difficult for players to keep track of how much movement points they did, when they used what, why, and how. So we ended up mostly cutting that. As we cut the building mechanic, that also really negated the value of rocks. Rocks basically became the equivalent of trees, because the big difference with rocks previously was they blocked line of sight, they were indestructible, and you could not leap onto them. So it was just an all-around not really needed solution. One thing rocks did do that we ended up just also removing was they blocked line of sight to aerial units, very similar to buildings do now in the game and as buildings did before. But as we cut down the tile sets, this just really simplified things. We also had this parking lot tile set, which you also see a little bit on the far end. That tile set was explicitly built around the concept of how could we have a more ongoing legacy game? Stuff that you track from mission to mission to mission that would gradually alter the game. The idea with the parking lots were they weren't as tough of concrete as roads. So the more your mechs walked back and forth across these various parking lot tile sets, they would destroy them. And those tile sets would turn into rubble squares. That wasn't very valuable. You also need to see that we had water that kind of went around some of the corners of the roads, or we had lakes, and off in the back you can see rivers and things like that. Originally, we allowed players to fill in water. It was extremely expensive. Eventually, we decided just to have the one little lake in the center of the map that generally restricts movement and manages a lot of that. But as you can see from this one, we really cut back on a lot of the tile sets. One thing that we did end up keeping for a very long time, though, is you'll see these hard-coded numbers sitting around the outside of the map on the lanes. These hard-coded numbers were originally the idea that enemies, you'd have a draw deck that you would custom build very similar to the Pathfinder card game. They had so many of this enemy, so many of these bonus or bane cards and similar ideas, and then you would draw from those decks for each individual mission. Eventually, we found that people actually preferred the more randomized draw decks with unknown quantities of enemies and kind of the draw pool. So rather than having it, oh, you flipped over this card, here's this enemy, a lot of people really started to have fun around the table ragging on the person that happened to draw the token that of the enemy that they didn't want more of out of the enemy draw pool, or if they got a bonus card, drew more of that enemy, and everybody praying they would draw it. It just added a little bit more dynamism to the core game. So as we progressed, you can see here that we started to transition more and more into the map that you're familiar with today. But there were a core couple examples. So this is one of our late stage maps. As you can see here, it's starting to look more and more like the main game. You have the variety of the structures on the right side, you have the more open field down the left, but it ended up a little bit bigger. So now making the transition from that, you can see we've lost almost all the core tile sets. We've started to bring in the ability of players to sticker and destroy concepts and start placing rubble and stuff on the road. But once again, this was one of our maps from just about 6 months ago, and you can see very clearly we are still planning the core lane mechanic we had. This is getting closer and closer to what we eventually delivered, but we had a very long way to get there. So what was another major step from getting from point A to point B? Here you can see one of our first prototype maps where we transitioned from having the base at the edge of the map to having it more at the bottom. This is where we also first started to come up with the concept of having a bridge. So you can see how the road just kind of goes off the end here. We were imagining this being a bridge and the enemies trying to destroy that or use that to get to the base. We were still a little bit undecided. But one thing you'll notice is we still had the 2-lane major roadways coming in, but this time we had split it. This was to remove the mechanic that was confusing players where you could build barricades or rubble on roads, but we had some enemies that had logic to go around them, and that was just yet another thing to track, which was yet another painful point. One other thing you'll see here is we had a whole bunch of partial chunky roads around, and the idea was there were just some obvious spots to build your loops and roads, and players would do so. Eventually, one of the things we learned was this was way too restrictive for the players. While it sounded good in concept, that works better in a video game than in a board game. In a board game, people really wanted the freedom to build roads wherever they wanted to build the roads. The other just oddity, this happened more happenstance, but you'll notice this was heavily loaded with buildings on the left and the more open area on the right, where eventually we transitioned that to the more open area on the left and the more buildings on the right. Part of the reason for that transition was we needed to turn the first mission into more of a tutorial. And as part of the first mission becoming more of a tutorial, we needed to only have people play on half the map so that we could explain, and we wanted that half of the map to be the more open area. Over a series of a couple of dozen play tests and just seeing different people's reactions to playing with on the left or the right side of the map, it just became somewhat obvious that people found it more intuitive when they first unpacked the game, when they first set it up, that playing on the left side of the map was where they would assume they were going to play. So that's how we ended up locking in on that decision. Now, a couple other things you'll see here is there was restricted ability to build roads even beyond what we had default laid out, just because of these 2 lanes that force the enemies to head in the singular direction towards the base. That also frustrated users because they felt like they couldn't really impact and there was almost no point in building roads. And being that the road building was one of the things from early on that we really wanted to be a core component of the game, yeah, we were willing to ditch it if it ended up not being fun for the players. We knew we had to change this, at least to try and see how the reaction ended up being. The final thing is we started to have the one point heading into the bridge or the base. And at first we thought that would be ideal. You'd have easier tracking, easier management, but this is about the point where we started to question that decision because we saw more and more players would wait for enemies to pile up in this area here, and then they would stack their mechs on the outside. They'd put some barriers down, other things, and just fight off the enemies from one spot. They didn't bother exploring the map. They didn't bother really manipulating the map because there wasn't much of a point when all the enemies were hitting one centralized point every single time. Shortly after we play tested on that map, we made some very substantial changes. The first thing you'll notice is you start to see the lane stickers on the outside. This allowed us to control which lanes enemies were coming in as we started to randomize the draw pools more and more. The other thing you'll notice is we started to have some obvious battlefield destruction. This came from two things. One, people felt that just having the solid buildings everywhere didn't really give the impression of much of a war zone. The other part was this was getting close to the time when we hired David White on to work on our art. And talking with him, he wanted more flexibility as far as how to manage the art and display the destruction and really make it an awesome map when the time came to do so. This was also the first time you start to see the bridge in a centralized point. This actually is a playtest map from one of our first groups that actually ran through all 12 missions of the playtest. They started, and actually, funny enough, another group finished before them, but that's a long story. But they eventually did finish this. They loved building roads. As you can see here, they have tons of loops over here, and the enemies were running circles everywhere. But one significant thing you'll notice is, in our current game, we do not allow you to build roads as close as we used to. This came out of a ton of playtesting that we did, where when people got later and later into the game, and we wouldn't have discovered this without having as many playtests as we did going all the way through the entire game, that when you have the mechs and the gunships moving potentially 16 spaces, and you have loops this small, and now imagine a few where they just built whole chains of loops down the side, which we actually had a couple groups do. You ended up with this nightmarish rolling scenario where every single enemy you moved on the board you had to roll turning dice for them 4, 5, 6 times every single round, and that just got really frustrating for a lot of players. As soon as we moved it out where you now had to do more like what you see as this road design here with a minimum of a 3x3 space between any given loop, suddenly that eased it up. You were maybe only doing 1 or 2 turns for each enemy, and as a result, players could move the enemies and get right back into what they loved best, which was killing things. Other than that, you'll see that this is mostly our finalized map, but we learned a couple things as well. So if you look at the far building down here, originally these were supposed to be big apartment complexes. And the idea was they were just solid structures. They blocked off line of sight on those 3 roads over there and made it generally difficult to manage. We ended up eventually cutting out the hole in the building because that enabled a couple of things. One, players could more easily build roads across the buildings and tear down just a couple sections. So it's more affordable and they're more encouraged to do so. Number 2, it just made it artistically look a lot nicer, quite frankly. But this was also the point where we started to shrink down the map to more the size that we wanted to do. Finally, we have more or less our final map as you see it here. You'll notice, once again, the great improvement in the art. We really love the work David White has done for almost all of our art in the game. It's been absolutely amazing. The other thing you'll start to see is we really extended out some of the rubble areas on the map. We added a few additional lines of trees into spaces. Generally, one of the things we found that players loved more than anything was actually having obstructions that they could manipulate. That's one of the things about a legacy game that we really learned over the past couple of years is players have to have stuff to destroy. They have to have a reason to want to manipulate the map. So while it was great to have big open areas from a gameplay perspective, and if we were just shipping a standard board game, we would probably have maybe half the buildings and half of the trees and a quarter of the rubble that you see here. But since players could modify stuff, since they could tear down trees and bash through them with their mechs, since they could tear down buildings and or take them out with explosive and other stuff, since they could build various barriers that sometimes were going to be alongside buildings, they really wanted to be able to grow and manipulate this and turn it into their own map. So the final couple steps were to enable that. Funny enough, one of our final changes that we learned from a couple playtests on this map, and only this map, was we needed to do something about making the players' roads not the end-all be-all. So this ended up resulting in us having a different colored road tile for the stickers that players build to build their loops and other mechanics into the map. The other thing is now our gunships have an ability called Recon. And this was one of the things that we had one of our early playtest groups come back and try the game again and just blew their mind. Was all of a sudden now the gunships prevented all the enemies from turning down player created roads. This, along with several other mechanics, including our mobile shield generators, broad shield ability, and many others we'll talk about during one of our enemy videos, really add an extra depth to the strategy and give players a lot of decisions that they have to make in order to determine whether or not they're going to be successful. Well, thank you for taking the time to watch this video. If you have any additional questions about any of these maps, any of our prototypes, and how we got where we are with it, feel free to ask me in the comments on YouTube, on the Kickstarter, or just send us a message or whatever you feel like. Thank you again. Have a good day.